Images and Words, a second studio album by Dream Theater, released in the summer of 1992, is considered by many to be their finest album. Let's discuss, shall we? There's no doubt about it that 1992's Images and Words is a sombre, introspective album which does a lot to define this band's sound going forward with their new vocalist. But the blueprint for this band was certainly laid down with its nod to its progressive roots, displays of musical virtuosity and bold and involving themes. This is Dream Theater's first album with new vocalist James LaBrie, and the band weaves strong, intricately constructed songs, while the operatically trained LaBrie shows an impressive range with his tenor. Rich Wilson describes this album in his book Lifting Shadows as a slab of near-perfect progressive music. But are these guys really progenitors of a new genre? Classic rock tells us that in 1990s the words metal and progressive were uncomfortable bedfellows, suggesting that any kind of cross-pollination between the two forms was just absurd. I just don't agree with this. I mean, I think a lot of what Rush were doing in the 1970s could easily be considered progressive metal, and the same for Iron Maiden in the 1980s. Let's not forget Queensryche's 1988 concept album Operation Mindcrime, wrapped up in prog sensibilities. I enjoy this move away from dumb metal. Not that I've got anything against dumb metal, but I like music to be more literary, thematic and conceptual. Interestingly, Mike Portnoy weighs in on this. Prog had become a dirty word. Bands like Metallica, Queensryche and Maiden had alluded to progressive rock influences, but never fully tapped into them. Others like Fate's Warning and Watchtower had done so, but couldn't quite make the breakthrough. We were the first band to truly marry metal and prog and take it to the mainstream. We really blew the doors off, and nobody's looked back since. I'm not sure I totally agree with Mike Portnoy here. I think releasing this album in 1992, he was fortuitous because we had an audience that were beginning to develop an appetite for music that was more ambitious, intricate, more interesting musical arrangements and themes. Especially after the spleen and bile of punk and new wave, it kind of started to fan down a bit. Of course, you had neo-prog in the early 80s, but that was for anoraks and train spotters and ne'er-do-wells and people who just couldn't get girlfriends. A bit like myself, I think. Although this album did receive a lot of positive reviews, there were some that were quite scathing. One said, "This album does for progressive rock what Nirvana's done for smelly cardigans." Nevertheless, it did do very well. It's an album that is featured quite heavily in the band's setlist to this day. The German magazine Rock Hard positively gushed over this album, describing Dream Theater as a supergroup. They were very complimentary of this album, saying that its versatility, the linking of different grooves, the melody elements within each song, shows how Dream Theater are style transcending like no other band. Again, I think this review seems somewhat hyperbolic. To my mind, Chris Welsh was not so enamoured with this record. He said, "Intense, melodramatic, demanding Dream Theater have obviously poured their hearts and souls into these carefully contrived performances. The result is music you couldn't claim to like or enjoy, rather more admire from a convenient distance. It's like watching nuclear scientists constructing the first atom bomb. You appreciate the expertise, but deplore the end result." But many consider this to be an incredibly influential album, an album that respects no boundaries in terms of musical style. With its nods to classic prog, it certainly forges a path within the prog metal milieu. And there's lots of cultural reference points throughout this album. For example, the abrupt ending of Pull Me Under. There's a little sonic doff of the cap to the Beatles' I Want You, She's So Heavy from Abbey Road. Bjork famously said singing is a celebration of oxygen. And James LaBrie breathes new life into Dream Theater after their first album. His vocals are heartfelt with perfect pitch and tone for the progressive metal stylings of this band. Winter Rose's loss is Dream Theater's gain, I guess. This band has certainly no respect for boundaries in their exploration of musical and conceptual styles. Like many of their albums, it is diverse and complex, made up of a jumble of time signatures, tones and profound lyrical musings. That multitude of elements that all contribute to the style-transcending sonic tapestry of this intriguing band. How about that for hyperbole? Certainly this band's solid execution of musical style set them apart from the metal bands of the 80s, and especially those Sunset Strip bands, many of which by 1991 had been thrown mercilessly under the bus. but this band were perceived somewhat differently. And being perceived as being somewhat different effectively shielded them from the scorched earth cultural shock that was the grunge movement, effectively striking the death knell for cock-worshipping spandex and lacquered bonnets in one fell swoop. AllMusic has described Dream Theater as a dense blend of progressive rock and post-Halen metal. The label progressive metal is appropriate here, with those heavy crunching guitars married to conceptual forays into literature and myth, like John Anderson, only less squeaky and plugged in. And it's the textures on this album that are interesting. This montage that is as genre-defying as it is enjoyable, focusing upon technical proficiency and thematic dalliances that we'd associate with the heyday of prog. Images and Words is where it all begins for me with this band. It's a deep, emotional, complex and personal work that deserves its plaudits. It was meant to be a double album, but I think that was too ambitious for this fledgling and financially challenged band at the time, I think. But is this their best album? I must admit I actually prefer the two albums that come after this to this one. I've heard fans describe this as one of their finest albums. Some consider it too poppy, conceptually light. But I think the general consensus is the band took a huge step forward with this one. Musically, like all Dream Theater's stuff, to be honest, it's an exquisite interplay between guitar phrasing and the excellent John Petrucci, and the incredible bass lines and flourishings of John Mayung, drummer Mike Portnoy, which is just absolutely awesome. They all breathe life into this marvellous collection of songs. Kevin Moore's keyboards really announce themselves interwoven skillfully through the intricately constructed songs, and LaBrie's vocals are impressive. Also, Pull Me Under gained the band a lot of airplay and subsequent success. The cover art is by Larry Fremantle. It brings together certain images suggested by the songs. One critic has described this as a kind of visual nostalgia. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this cover. It's a triumph of Photoshop, I think. It looks like Carl Witters has vomited his breakfast over the front page of Vogue magazine. But the art does allude to lots of little references in the lyrics of the album. It's a bit like a prog metal version of Where's Waldo. You have to kind of find them all. Pull Me Under is an interesting one with enigmatic guitar tones, referencing Shakespeare's most famous Dane, of course. Another Day is a song written by John Petrucci for his father, haunting opening with that delicate guitar tone and mewing vocals by James LaBrie. An excellent saxophone on this by Jay Beckenstein. Taking the time with its wonderful scattershot openings, feels like a doff of the cap to Judas Priest to me. Great bass flourishes interspersed with some interesting keyboard stabs. According to Wikipedia, this song samples quite a few other tracks, namely Curtis Blow's Christmas Rapping, Frank Zappa's Dancing Fool, and Public Enemy's Power to the People. Metropolis Part 1 Miracle of the Sleep is possibly the best track on this album. When I listen to it, I keep expecting Subdivisions by Rush to begin. The bass solo in the middle of this is fantastic. It introduces the keyboard part, and James LaBrie's vocals are absolutely operatic performance from him. Under the Glass Moon, I love the guitar start. This reminds me a little bit of Pink Floyd's Sorrow. And absolutely great falsetto work on this. Reminds me of those Uriah Heep early albums. Wait for Sleep is a beautiful, delicate piano-driven number, and LaBrie's vocals here are nuanced and restrained, which certainly breathes life into the composition overall. Learning to Live, I love the keyboard start at the beginning of this one. My daughter calls it electronic bloopery. Great intro overall and shows this band exploring different time signatures. Edith Piaf said singing is a way of escaping. I'm no longer on this earth. This song certainly transports the listener in a song that's ultimately about acceptance and resolution. This album overall, I don't think it's the best Dream Theater album, although it's one that explores a myriad of different genres and moods, from metal to prog to even funk at times. It's certainly a hodgepodge of different influences all brought together and repackaged for a new audience. Prog is certainly a genre that takes us down some interesting avenues. We can be cast adrift upon topographic oceans, even having to explore some dark Orwellian themes all wrapped up in some sort of strange beast fable. Or exploring or lamenting an age gone by, selling England by the pound or two. And Dream Theater has a music that takes on this conceptual heritage and reframes it within the context of contemporary metal. Anyway, there's my review of Dream Theater's Images and Words. If you enjoyed this, please do click like, subscribe, and do check that notification bell. And share this video if you know someone else who may enjoy it. Other than that, I'll leave you with my closing catchphrase, which is, hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.